Okay, good evening everybody, and thank you ever so much for coming to this, our second public lecture in a series of 4 celebrating all things Italian. And I mean, it's linked very much to the Italian Connections Museum exhibition that's on in Street Life at the moment. I'm pointing because it's, you know, the building's directly behind us, it's not in the other room. And if you haven't already been able to get down there, it's, you know, please do go. And please do keep sharing the stories with us. So with us, colleague and myself are both lecturers in Italian at Hull, and Sarah then, who is really kind of, you know, the main brains behind how that's turned out in there, I think. So do keep sharing stories with us, because I think all 3 of us are really fascinated to hear stories of experiences of Italy that we haven't perhaps managed to capture, and being in the space then, the stories that come back to you whilst you're looking around. So I think we're all interested in those stories. Now, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor David Atkinson, who is Professor of Cultural and Historical Geography at Hull. I'm going to call you an honorary member of the Italian section for this evening, because David's research area, well, amongst many things, because I've just been looking at your bio and I'm going to pull it up so that I get this right. Geographies of the dark 20th century, but perhaps, and probably what you're going to be talking about this evening, the roles of geographical sciences in the production of modern Italy and Italian colonial spaces. And I suspect we're, a journey through spaces in modern Rome. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, David, and say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much for everyone for inviting me along. It's a great pleasure to be here. I actually came to Hull almost 20 years ago, April 1998. I thought for a couple of years, in a way that Larkin talked about, some people come in for a couple of years and then stay a lifetime. I thought that would never happen to me. 20 years on almost, I'm still here. But I came here because of the very strong Italian studies department. I'm a geographer, human geographer, and I'll explain that in a moment. But I came here because there's a very strong Italian department, as was. It's now part of the wider school. And indeed, there's a focus of people working on modern 20th century Italy as well, which was one of the leading places in the UK for this. So I've come here. Quite a lot of those people have retired or moved on in the last 20 years, so there's less of us now than there were. But that's one of the reasons. Italy is actually, paradoxically, one of the reasons why I find myself here. And my research career, I've been at this job for 20 odd years, 25 years I think, has focused quite a lot around Italy. I've broadened out into other topics, into work in English language topics, but my basic stuff, I'll show you what I do, vaguely what I do. But what I'm doing, I'm a professor of cultural and historical geography. You might be thinking, what's that? And you'd be right to think, what's that, for most of you, because it's something that's only emerged about 20 odd years ago or so. I was one of the first people who did this new form of geography. And so we ask all kinds of questions, which I think are very interesting, about how are places and spaces, the world in which we live, the places through which we move or we have attachments to, and the spaces in which we live our lives. How are they made sense of, how are they represented, and that might be in literature or in film or TV or other media, in art or whatever it might be. How are they represented? How do we understand the world around us by thinking about it, or the city of Hull or the city of Rome? How do we make sense of these places and spaces and these various representations? How do we like some places or dislike others, or are scared or worried about places, or affectionate towards different sites, or remember certain places in different types of ways? How is all this understood differently depending on what we call your subjectivities? If you're old or young, or if you're male or female, or you're able-bodied or less able-bodied, or whatever it might be, then spaces like the home or the street or the public square or the piazza are experienced and understood in very different ways. So we think about ideas like that as well. And we think about how these things all shift and change and move and evolve as time moves on. Or indeed, in a piazza, you might think about how different groups use it during the day in different types of ways, from the morning, early morning, through to late at night. I might talk about an example of that a little bit later on. And so this is now finding its way across academic geography in the universities, and indeed it's just arrived last August, on the A-level curriculum, which is the way these things work, about 20-year lag or so. And there's a new changing places module on, so all A-level students have got to pick somewhere which is a changing place. And Hull's a very good example of that, with City of Culture and the various industrial kind of shifts that have taken place in the city over the years. So that's what a cultural and historical geographer is. And I'm the historical and cultural geographer who works on Italy, and I'm in a proud group of one doing that work, which means I'm simultaneously the best and the worst at doing these things. But what I do, my PhD was about how Italian society understood their place in the world in the 1930s and 1940s, in the late fascist period, in the Second World War period, about how they understood their place in the world, and how geographers, academic geographers and professional geographers who might be with the Istituto Geografico Militare or other cartographic organisations worked to try and educate the Italian public through high-blown academic theory or cartographic surveys, or indeed popular, ordinary, everyday texts and images and sometimes kids' cartoon books about Italy and the sense of Italy as a nation, and Italy as a nation with a destiny in the Mediterranean, or indeed a new empire in North and East Africa. So that was my PhD, and I'm working on those things ever since. I've branched out into a sense of how do these same people, these geographers, are people working with ideas about places and spaces, how we think about, conceptualise and understand the world, how they were involved in the construction of Libya in particular as a colonial domain, and carving out a sense of Italian territory, a noble, comprehensible Italian territory, mapped and measured and surveyed in a European sense, and captured in European, what we call epistemologies, forms of knowledge, and it might be maps or surveys or statistics or data or written descriptions or photographs of the desert, and saying this is now colonial territory, this is Italy, as it was from 1934, Italy proper as a formal part of the Italian nation state. And I've not worked on this for a while, but I spent about 10 years or so working on the city of Rome, mainly because I moved there to do my PhD. And I then just became interested in the city because I'm the only person doing this kind of work. The field was wide open. And so I started beavering around in the archives and libraries and exploring the natures of this fascinating, wondrous, multi-layered, historically variegated, astonishing city. And so I did quite a lot of work on Rome as well. And I've not done much on that of late, although until a couple of years ago I took a field trip every year to Rome with students, and I taught them about the city as well. So I dealt with its politics, its memories, its people, its public spaces, and that's what I'll try to talk about today. But in general, because again, like this stuff about cultural and historical geography I discussed earlier, we can start to think about as geographers, as cultural and historical geographers, which we are all at the moment, of course, how do these spaces work? How do they function? How do they play roles in society? How are they created and carved out by powerful organisations or bodies like the church or governments or a powerful industrial conglomerate or something like that? And what do they therefore do? Do they celebrate the church or the monarchy or the republic or a particular form of capitalism or whatever it might be? And how therefore is this then changed or challenged by people who move through that space? If there's a demonstration going on in that space, does it undermine the meanings? Is it resisting? Is it protest? Or if people are celebrating those spaces, or if people are using them in different types of ways, then we might think about all these different ways of thinking through public spaces, and therefore understand how this rather amorphous idea of the city as a unit on the face of the earth in which an awful lot of human life takes place, how the city is changing and shifting and understood and experienced by people on a daily process. So we might understand that through discussions and understanding of public spaces. And of course, you're all already thinking this is not new. The Romans did this. Everyone does this. Public spaces are part of sociability. They're part of the human condition, the way in which we live and we learn and we talk to each other, and we do it in certain types of spaces and public spaces. But public spaces started to emerge with clear senses, well, in fact, they've always, public spaces have had some kind of clear sense of rules and decorum about what can you do with your body, what kind of things can you say, how can you interact in those spaces, what is appropriate and proper behaviour, and what isn't. And this is writ large. Any classicist will tell you about the Roman forums, Roman fora, and the way in which they were regimented with ideas about who could go there and who could talk, and how a triumphant procession in from a conquering emperor or general would walk the way down the Via Sacra and all the way into the heart of the Roman Forum, and they'd be received on the steps of the Senate House and so on and so forth. All this is all public space, and celebrations and performance and the animation of that space by individuals. And then in daily stuff, when the big parades weren't happening, it might be a space of democracy or politics or business or meeting spaces of people chatting and learning and trading and so on and so forth. It happened in the Renaissance period, it happened in the medieval and in the early modern periods about, and this is the Capitoline Square in the centre of Rome, about civic functions, about splendour and about the glories of the church or the glory of the city and so on and so forth. So you keep on getting these public spaces being created through the history of Rome, and anyone who goes there travels these spaces, goes through them while enacting and performing them in all kinds of interesting ways today. As tourists, you see somebody there in the foreground with her phone up taking pictures and everybody else standing around. So there's a routine sense of public spaces. Or the church, of course, in Rome gets involved as well, creating great, fantastic public spaces. I mean, I say fantastic in terms of their scale, in terms of their grandeur and their splendour, and the way in which they're designed to impress and to awe. Some people might argue to subdue the people who come here and gather. And so you know these kind of arenas, which we all know, we all have a sense of how might you behave. It's actually, the Vatican is quite interesting because there's certain rules about decorum, about what people might wear, not wearing too little or behaving in certain types of ways as well. And it's now fenced off in the evenings as well. It's not people going in case they get behaviour they don't think is appropriate. There's security issues there as well. You see all these kind of arguments, there we go, taking place in these big spectacular showpiece sites, but also, this slide is just to remind us that it's not just Vatican Square or Campo De Fiori or Piazza Navona. It's also the routine little spaces of Rome. Think about littering or loitering or where do we kind of do certain types of things. These rules apply in the way in which we live our lives in everyday spaces. So this is cultural geography. This is the kind of things that people can do these days. So what I'll do, I'll ask to talk about modern Rome. So I'll stretch that a little bit by going back and talking about 3 little case studies. So early modern Rome, the historians would say, about papal Rome, and then I've got 4 cases actually. Papal Rome, and then liberal Italy from the unification of Italy in 1861, 1870 when Rome was incorporated. And then fascist Rome, which is where I've done most of my research. And then the modern city as well, in which I spend quite a bit of time, and then I took students around as well. So I've got quite a lot of text here. I won't go through all of it, but the idea of the papal Rome, this is when the church in its zenith as a global authority, the way in which people would understand themselves in the cosmos, their place in relation to God, and their place in relation to getting to heaven, and the church and the Pope as being the gateway to that, the interpretation of God's law and God's rules, and therefore the base, the headquarters of the church, and the Vatican down here as being a huge, spectacular site. And this is articulated through artwork, we know, through the scale of the building in the church, through the monuments, through all kinds of spaces, internal and external, through which people would be, through which they would move, and in which they would understand the nature of their place as being allowed and permitted to be part of the church as long as they were true believers, and so on and so forth. One interesting story, actually, I'll come back to this a little bit later on, but this is one of the things I've done a little bit of work on in the past, is this sense of the vistas and the landscapes of Rome and how they were transformed in the 1920s and 1930s by the fascist regime. So the Vatican Square originally was accessed by these 2 small roads, you see, one going down there and one going down that way. And this was a very conscious notion that you would kind of be walking down this very narrow streets and then suddenly you would come out to this enormous, great big piazza, and the sense of awe and wonder and seeing the basilica at the other side of this and the obelisk in the centre and so on was part of the theatre, the way that the landscape had been manipulated to make that clear to people, the sudden surprise and the sudden moments of the reveal. This was all altered in 1929, 1934, when the regime of Mussolini built the Via della Conciliazione right down the centre there. So the shot we all understand, the Sea of the Vatican these days, of course, is one framed by a particular regime with particular intent and particular understandings of history and how the church and Rome and history and ancient Roman history and so on had to be understood. I'll probably talk about some of those issues a little bit later on. So, but the church created these spaces throughout the city to communicate a sense of the Catholic Church and its ideologies and its sense of priorities about what was important, what was the role of people, what was the role of women, what was the role of children, what was the role of the sinner, what was the role of the righteous person, so on and so forth. And all these things were then embedded in the landscape. This is cultural historical geography, how these ideas both written into the rules of how we behave ourselves and how we engage with people, but also the spaces, the scene, the setting, the arena in which all this activity takes place. So you get a whole series of public spaces carved out in the city, increasingly spectacular as the years go by, and particularly in response to the Protestant Reformations in Northern Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, the idea of the Baroque form of architecture being established in the great Baroque facades on various churches around the city, and then some of the spaces which were created again, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But the Capitoline Square, built over 100 years designed by Michelangelo, is an example of this, or Bernini's St. Peter's Square. I talked about that and the way in which this sense of theatre was written into the landscape. This is all part of the story. Or indeed, the Trevi Fountain on the left-hand side here, or the Piazza Navona on the right-hand side. This is very early in the morning when I was to take this picture. Obviously, it's normally thronged with tourists. But the sense of the theatre, of a fountain of the four rivers in the centre with an obelisk on the top and a big public space, and then the church to this side, or indeed the spectacular theatre of the Trevi Fountain. This is all spectacle in the city. These are all the spaces which are now thronged with tourists. Everybody who goes to the city these days wants to see these sites. It was ever thus. They were designed for precisely these purposes. So we can plough back through the history and try to understand what was the ideology at work behind this. What was the notion that you should understand about the Trevi Fountain that's created by the popes, who were bringing water into the city, clean, fresh, running water in the same way that Roman emperors of the past had done. And all this rhetoric was understood by people at the time. We've lost a sense of that over the centuries, but nevertheless, this is how we can think about these spaces and how they've changed and evolved and progressed as the years go by. I won't go through all that detail there, but the Sixtus V, of 1585 to 1590, got an awful lot of work done in just a 5-year period before his death. But he was known as the planning pope and redesigned the city really significantly. I should have put a map in at this stage, actually, or a more modern map than the one you can see. But that was a postcard which tourists to the city, pilgrims to the city, would be able to pick up as they moved in through one of the gateways. And they'd be able to find their way around the various different sites of the Colosseum, which you see is down here, and Santa Maria Maggiore, which is over here. Maria Maggiore, I think, and the no, sorry, I think. Hang on, I'm getting confused now. Oh, this is the Vatican, I think, over here. St. John Lateran, I think, over there. Maria Maggiore, that's right. Colosseum down here, and then these various routeways, which were carved out in just 5 years or so by Sixtus V, the great planning pope. These big vistas, and you recognise some of these if you've been to the city. That you look down a road and you'll see an obelisk at the far end, or the facade of a church. One of the great, I forget the name from them now. We'll see, the seven, the really important churches, the basilicas, the 7 basilicas in the city. And you'll see one of these things, and if you were a pilgrim, you'd be able to navigate your way around the city. So this dense medieval network of streets was suddenly blown away by Sixtus V, and created this city as a what we call a panopticon, something you could be viewed, you could see from one end to the other. So the Corso right down the centre of the city, or indeed linking things like the Spanish Steps and the obelisk at the top there. That you'd be able to move around the city, the Tridenti, the tridents around the Corso, shaping the northern part of the city centre. These were all carved out in explicit attempt to make the city legible, make it workable, make it a spectacle for people coming from all over the Christian world to visit the city and its various basilicas and sites, which were now connected by this Renaissance splendour of straight streets, which is also about the command of geometry and so on and so forth. So I won't go into too much about that, but nevertheless there's this sense of public spaces being used and transformed and changed and evolved as the years go by. And you get a similar kind of story, you can see we're racing through history here, you get a similar kind of story with the rise of liberal Rome from 1870 to 1922, the first modern expression of the Italian nation. Well, it's liberal Rome from 1870 to the Italian nation from 1860s, but 1870 when Rome was brought within the Italian nation state and taken off the papacy as the troops came through the Porta Pia, which you see up here on the right hand side, which was then monumentalised in public space by the liberal regime thereafter. This is the key moment, the key site at which the city of Rome, the city of the popes, the emperors, of art and history and glory and memory, was brought into the natural capital of Italy, was brought into the new reborn Italy, the new nation. So this becomes a site which nobody actually visits, because it's out on the hill that beyond Termini, or virtually nobody visits, but it's nevertheless at one particular time it was a key centre of spectacle and ceremony for the Italians. And indeed every now and again, every the anniversary of the fall of Rome, 20th September, then they have a ceremony there as well. So you get sites like that which have fallen out of favour in contrast to the Vatican or the Piazza Navona or wherever else. And there's a new form of monumental architecture which was evolved by the liberal regime as well. You see the Ministry of Justice on the bottom right side there. And this is the international Beaux-Arts style of the period of the late 19th, early 20th century. This was finished in 1911, the Ministry of Justice. But this is again an attempt to kind of articulate a new sense of Italianità, of a new modern nation, bearing comparison with the capital cities such as Paris or Budapest or London or Berlin or the new other important European powers at that particular time, and indeed to transform the papal city into an Italian capital city. An awful lot of controversy and contestation between the Pope, who after 1870 retreated into the Vatican and didn't come out until it was 1943, 1944 with the bombing of the city by American Air Force planes in 1944, late 1943, I forget the exact date. But the Pope, self-styled prisoner in the Vatican, saying, give the Mother Church back her city and her territories in central Italy. And the Italian nation state, at the cost of excommunication for anyone who stood for public office in the Italian nation state, or indeed the Rome City Council in the late 19th century, built these big new structures and said, here is a new nation state. And so the public spaces, the bridges going across to the over the Tiber to the finance minister, the Ministry of Justice, or indeed another spectacular space I'll show you, and monument I'll show you in a moment, all part of that story of making a new national capital for Italians rather than the papacy. And at the same time the city is growing at pace as well with very little efficient planning, so there's all kinds of issues and problems there, but nevertheless there's some key set piece examples in the centre. And I'll show you a relatively low key one and then get onto a larger key one on the right hand side. The low key one is Campo De Fiori on the left hand side. And this is an example of a space which has changed its meanings over time, and it changed its meanings over this stretch of 24 hours per day. In the morning, as some of you will know, it's a market. It used to be one of the key market spaces of modern Rome. I used to buy vegetables and bits and pieces of things there occasionally. It's a bit more aimed at tourists these days, but nevertheless, it's a market during the morning, and then it's a place where school kids traditionally come and hang out after their lessons are finished in the early afternoon. And then later on in the evening, it's a space where the restaurants would open up and people would go out for dinner. Now increasingly and interestingly, it's become a site of slight moral panic, because there's many lots of bars there and lots of overseas students who've mushroomed in Rome in the last 15-20 years or so, and indeed lots of tourists, and tourist numbers have gone through the roof with the rise of low-cost airlines, and particularly from the year 2000 and the Jubilee celebrations. Then you get these huge numbers of people drinking in that piazza now. So it's become a very kind of different type of space than it used to be. But through the day, you get all these different groups moving through it, using it in different types of ways. In the past, it was a very politicised space as well. It was one of the centres of the, not too far from the Vatican, the centres of hospitality for pilgrims travelling from around Christendom to Rome in the early modern and modern period. There's no church on the piazza, however, so which is an interesting issue. Very few piazzas, or large piazzas, haven't got churches on them. And so it therefore grew a slightly kind of anti-papal legacy, if you like, or reputation. And so when the Italians took over Rome and the papal city in the 18th century, they erected this statue in the centre of Giordano Bruno, the philosopher and thinker who, I think it was about a 13-year trial with the papacy, on a point of academic exactitude. He managed to kind of argue himself all the way to the death penalty by not retracting, and he was the Vatican liked him. He was a great thinker, a key international academic of his time, but over intransigence and arguments about minutiae, I forget the details, he managed to argue himself into a corner whereby the only thing left to do was to execute him. So he was burnt at the stake on this particular site. The statue was erected here in 1898. You see it there in the middle of this picture. There's Bruno gloomily looking down upon the square in which he died. But this was erected by the Italian government as an anti-papal gesture in this slightly kind of anti-establishment site. They put a particularly anti-papal sign, symbol, right in the centre of it. And this mattered in 1898 when it was opened, because the people who were gathered to celebrate the opening of this symbol of anti-papal Rome as a capital of Italy were all gathered around, and then a pro-papal mob turned up as well, and they started fighting over this statue. And I forget the exact figure. I think it was 8 or 9 people were killed, stabbed to death over a statue. But that's how much these things and public spaces and a statue like this, laden with symbolism and with significance, would therefore motivate people to kind of fight to the death over these places. So we talk about these, on my field trip I used to, we talk about these particular sites and spaces and how they change. And that kind of anti-establishmentism stretched right through to the 1970s and 1980s or so. There's a bookshop there, which is a left-wing bookshop, and the cinema at the end. Apparently I'm told by one of my colleagues who used to work in Italian here at the university, used to be the hangout for all the students who, of course, in 1968 were convinced that revolution was around the corner. It was just a matter of time before that would happen. And apparently he said we used to go to the cinema there, and then when the adverts came on, bourgeois capitalism, they'd boo out the adverts until they stopped and they'd back to the film, whatever they were watching, James Bond or something, at that particular time. So that's in the Cinema Farnese, just at the far end of the square. So that's one way in which you can think about these sites in modern Rome. A second way is this Vittorio Emanuele II monument, the symbol of the new Italy, the new national monument to the King of Italy. Let me just show you a couple of more. So here he is, Vittorio Emanuele, looking out across the city at the other key institution marked out in the skyline about the papacy, the dome of St. Peter's there. But suddenly, if I just whip back very quickly to my first picture, the other thing which marked, and you all know this if you've been to Rome, the other thing which marks the skyline in this stark white Brescian marble, which was quarried in the north and brought down especially for the task because it never fades, it never loses its white, dazzling white lustre, is the Vittorio Emanuele II monument up there, contesting the skyline with the symbol of the papacy. Let me just get back to where I should be. Well, you see it there, and you get some kind of sense as well of the epic scale. You want to see if you've been to Rome, you understand this. But the epic scale and the way in which it stands out from the surrounding landscape. This is geography writ large. This is a way of actually transforming the city. And the entire piazza in front of it, you see, my cursor. Here we go. The piazza was changed around this. There's a smallish piazza down there. Lots of buildings were demolished, and then this new one was built, and a replica of the 15th century piazza, Palazzo Venezia over here. So the big square that you all are familiar with, and the site of the National Monument, was all created, again, spaces and spectacle and so on and so forth, to create this enormous spectacle, which then told a story about the new entity, the nation-state of Italy, arriving and seizing the city, their capital city now, not the papal city. And so they tell the stories of Vittorio Emanuele II here, and the provinces of Italy represented on the frieze in the background, of the medieval cities of the great trading cities of Italy represented on this frieze in the centre, and the Dea Roma, the goddess of Rome, right here in the centre. And if we see it here, what it does, and this is moving towards our history, it echoes the form of the Capitoline Square that's around the corner, the Campidoglio, with the goddess of Rome, who is here in the heart of the city hall built on old Roman ruins, with the statue of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, in the foreground. And you see that same idea of the equestrian statue and the goddess of Rome in the same form just around the corner, but on this epic scale of marking the presence of a new nation state. So this is a monument as geography, and then the spaces which are created around it are geographical as well. At least this big piazza in the foreground, but also, we'll get onto this in a second, these two roads, the Via del Mare, as it was understood in the 1920s, and the Via dell'Impero, as it was understood in the 1930s, created between the Colosseum down here and the National Monuments, and Mussolini's balcony, which was down here. So we'll talk about this next stage now of fascist Rome, 1922-1945. This is why I got interested in this material, because I was living in the city and nobody had written anything about it. This is a few people, a few pioneering architectural historians have started to broach the ideas of fascism and its engagement with architecture, building and planning and landscape in the early 1980s through to the later 1980s, and I arrived in Rome in 1991. And nobody else had really engaged with the city and the landscape and how it had been transformed and transfigured by this regime, which had a very clear agenda, it seems to me, but nobody was really dealing with it because it's still relatively sensitive. And it was 1990s, it was 40, 50 years or so after the fall of the regime, so still sensitive. It was still a difficult topic, so people weren't really working with these ideas. But there is a whole way in which the whole modern city of Rome, until actually around about 10 years ago, was still, you might argue, and I've made this case in a couple of publications, is still essentially, in some respects, in the centre, a fascist city, or designed to be engaged by the viewer or by somebody walking through the city in the way in which the fascist regime intended it to be understood, as a site of spectacle, but one which communicated stories about the fascist regime and the past, the church, and the liberal regime we just talked about, and particularly the Roman antiquity and the idea of a kind of trans-historical connection between Mussolini and ancient emperors 2,000 years beforehand. And so this road you see here, the Via dell'Impero, on the right-hand side, built at enormous expense between I think it was October 1931, no, November 1931 and October 1932 to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the fascist regime. It opened, I've got a shot of this in a second, by Mussolini. Here he is, riding down from the Colosseum at one end, down the Via dell'Impero, on his charger with his gerarchia, his hierarchy all around him. And this is the idea of ancient Rome as represented by the Colosseum being connected to his office and his balcony from which he gave his public speeches here in a direct line. If you look at it, I did this with students, and it's easier now because the road's blocked off from traffic most of the time, particularly on Sundays it used to be entirely free. There's a direct line that goes straight down between the balcony and the centre of the Colosseum, and it's spectacularly striking if you're there, if you see it. It's not very clear on maps, it's not always very clear on images, but the understanding, the way we see and understand the Colosseum these days is from this fascist perspective. The way in which we see this area down here, and the Piazza Venezia, is again carved out from this liberal and then transformed again by this fascist regime. And they're using the landscape and they're using the city to tell stories, to impel people to think in certain types of ways. And this is the kind of thing that we can do with our geographical theories. So, these are fascist landscapes. This is just after completion, so lots of these lots of these trees have grown into full mature trees since then. But in this area around here, what they're doing is exposing, this is a forum of Caesar, the forum of Augustus over there, exposing ancient ruins, knocking down stuff in the meantime. Something like 5,000 families or people, 5,000 families were evicted to make way for this route. It was built in just 11 months, so of course the evictions were really rapid and relatively heartless, and people who moved out to rapidly built essentially kind of transitory quarters on the edge of the city, which had no transport connections, no real kind of clear sanitation or whatever, the borgati they were called. These people living on in the outskirts, but their social connections, their places of work and sociability were all in the centre of the city, so people felt very dislocated by this. It was a totalitarian regime which didn't care about those individuals in that respect. It created this very spectacular space. I don't mean this in a positive or celebratory fashion, but it is, I think, the most spectacular size of 20th century totalitarianism in Europe. Is more spectacular than anything that any of the other regimes at large in 20th century Europe. This is the dark 20th century that I talk about and I do quite a bit of my work on. Nobody did anything quite as spectacular as this, and nobody did anything which was articulating senses of history and educating in a pedagogic fashion people how to think about their history and their identity as a result of history and monuments and ruins and their landscapes in a way in which this particular site did. Although also, for those of you who know the city, you'll find places like this. This is Lago Argentina. Again, a major kind of point at which lots of buses and trams converge and people pass through, and it's always very busy during the middle of the day in the heart of the old city, which again was opened up and cleared out down to the historic level of various Roman temples, some of which are re-excavated. So the columns are put up to make them look more spectacular. This is something else. A man called Antonio Munoz, who's a director of antiquity and replanning in the 1930s, had this sense of you can't just create an empty space, you've got to make it look more spectacular, you've got to create something for people to look at and to understand and then to feel moved by, emoted by in some respect. So you get the routine bits and pieces of spaces such as the Lago Argentina, or the very spectacular set pieces such as the Via dell'Impero, all of which were established in the modern city. And then the way in which it is animated by people in a political sense are these so-called Oceanic Assemblies which took place in the 1930s. It's interesting, I tried to do some work on this, and nobody was really recording these things really at the time, or nobody was ever writing down this totalitarian regime, so people wouldn't talk necessarily about what they were doing in these sites or these spaces, or indeed I've not found anything about how they were organised. The Via dell'Impero, I did find out, had, again, this is about animated spaces, the particular routes which you see Mussolini marching down there had around about 320 parades on it in every single year. So that's virtually every day a parade was taking place, and people were bussed in and trained in from all over Italy to march up and down, often in their black shirts or their uniforms or whatever aspect of the regime they were representing, to march between the Colosseum and Piazza Venezia and the centre of the fascist regime. So every single day people would be parading up and down. And I've got one of my publications, I found a splendid picture of road sweepers who all had special little bicycles with bins attached to them for their road sweeping business, and they were riding in formation, riding down the Via dell'Impero as part of this ordinary, everyday, mundane fascist spectacle of everybody. They didn't have a vote, but the idea was everybody was playing a part in the regime. Everybody's being part of the performance of fascism, but it happened in these sites. It created these particular sites and routes and spaces in which the political religion, Emilio Gentili calls it, the political religion of fascism could be enacted, could be performed, could animate the city in all kinds of ways. And you see that therefore as well in these Oceanic Assemblies. And so again, from what little we know about them, somebody's done some oral histories with some elderly people who went there, and they'd say, well, this became a relatively subversive site, because if you could go to the Oceanic Assembly, yes, Mussolini was on the balcony, he was shouting, but it was spectacular. There was music, there was searchlights, there were planes flying overhead. It was a spectacle. It was exciting. It was different in those respects. It also says there's no surveillance in there because you're away from your mum and dad, from your parents, or you're not in the charge of of a church organisation as people might have been 20 years previously. And indeed you're not in charge of some fascist organisation because there's a big crowd. So this was somewhere where people had their first cigarettes or their first kisses or their first liaisons with various other people. They'd go there because there was something happening, because it was an offence. It's not necessarily people celebrating fascism. It's people just being sociable in a space. Some of them would be there to celebrate fascism, some might not. Some might be there to escape surveillance, as I was saying, to do what they wanted to. Mussolini's up there on his balcony giving his oration, but nevertheless you get all these senses of the people animating these spaces. So this is the kind of thing which this approach can start to articulate. Then on the final stage of fascism, and again this is the thing is quite interesting, is also the sense of moving 5,000 families out of the pathway of the Vita Impero in just 11 months or so was problematic, and also those powerful families owned various buildings. They had to be bought off at great expense. The church still had an awful lot of power and leverage, so if churches were on the route as well, and they had to kind of negotiate these sites and these places. So after the early to mid 1930s, 1934, 1935, the regime started building new sites on the outskirts of Rome, greenfield sites, where they could do what they wanted, empty spaces to create what I call fascist landscapes. So rather than negotiating the presence of an ancient city in history and memory and so on, they could just do what they wanted. And we start to see things like the Stadio Olimpico complex and the Foreign Office Ministry building, which is over here. So it's this kind of classic big totalitarian kind of scale and so on. And the interesting thing about, again, some of you may know this is now the Olympic Stadium in Rome, and there's an obelisk there in the foreground, this icon of the obelisk everywhere throughout the city. But it still says down the front of the obelisk, Mussolini, Dux, leader. And every Saturday or Sunday there's football crowds go there. The Olympics were held there in 1960, the World Cup final in 1990. So everybody wanders past this particular site and backwards and forwards. And the avenue behind it, again, not many people go there unless it's for sporting events. But the avenue is full of mosaics celebrating the triumphs of the fascist regime. And it's interesting economy of memory here is that the city routinely repairs these mosaics. In some places, Germany, they would have destroyed that or let it go to ruin and let the kind of weeds take over slowly. And in Italy, partly because of economic problems of ruin after the war, but there's infrastructure there, so they just keep it going. But now they keep on restoring it. So there's interesting stuff about memory, about how do you celebrate the past. Do you get rid of the past? But of course that's what Mussolini did, and we don't necessarily approve of that. Do you therefore keep the past and learn from it, or so on and so forth? All kinds of interesting issues which emerge in these particular spaces. Or indeed the EUR site down to the southwest of the city. Again, this was explicitly Mussolini getting tired, Mussolini and his planners, getting tired of negotiating the historic fabric of the city and moving us heart of a new Rome, 7 miles or so down the Tiber towards the sea and towards Ostia. And this was going to be the heart of, as they saw it, a city of 20 million people stretching 40 miles inland from the Alban Hills down to the Tyrrhenian coast, and a great imperial capital in the year 2000. This was the plan, a great imperial capital of a Mediterranean empire. Of course, none of this came to pass, but nevertheless, here was a central summit or the central spaces which were being created at that particular time. So we can think about all these kind of issues as well. Modern Rome, 1945, I'll just very quickly just mention this. And again, one of the interesting things is, because of lack of finance and lack of money, and the sense of Rome still being relatively, felt still in some respects like a smallish town, through to the 1990s or around to 2000 or so, when it seemed to ramp up, the house prices and tourist numbers ramped up markedly. There's no really significant modern building in the city in that particular period. It's still, the city remained the historic city, but overlain with the last layer of building was the fascist regime's presentation of Rome and Rome's history. You get certain things which happened since then, some spectacular things like Richard Mayer's Anapachis Museum, or Zaha Hadid's Maxi 20th Century Art Museum, you see on the right hand side there, and Anapachis on the left hand side. And more modern building is actually taking place. Every time I go, I see more bits and pieces of things happening. But it wasn't it's only slow and piecemeal in contrast to the stuff that the liberal regime did and the fascist regime did. So you get a whole new layer of sites and spaces which are emerging in this particular period, but it's different to the stuff which has gone before. So we're left there, and I'll wrap up I think with this. We're left with a series of other points about how does a city like Rome deal with its various patinas, these layers, these palimpsests of memory which are overlaid and interrupt and poke through each other in various different ways. There's all kind of interesting layered metaphors that people writing about the city have tried to do from Sigmund Freud onwards, try to talk about the city and its memory and its sense of itself and the way in which Rome is there, or the ancient Rome is there, or the papacy is here, or the liberal regime is next to it, and the fascist regime is next to that. How do you kind of make sense of this landscape? How do you make sense of the histories and the memories, and so on and so forth? What do we do with monuments which are awkward or difficult? Do we keep them? Do we celebrate them? Do we let them naturally decay? All these debates are ongoing and rumbling forward through Italian society. Not as much as you might imagine, but they're there in the background, while people carry on living through the city, living in this landscape and living through the spaces that have been created for a whole series of reasons which I've outlined already. These are some of my students on a field trip, looking quite happy, relatively pleased with themselves, in the Roman Forum. It's probably about 4 or 5 years ago, this lot. And again, Roman gladiators with licenses, because they started fighting over the best pictures, ironically, outside the Colosseum. Gladiators scrapping again, 1800 years on. So these are some of the guys who got the licenses dressed up, and you all know they charge you for the photograph and so on. So they offer to have a photograph with them. They're after €10 for the benefit. I tell this to my students. I used to tell this to my students every year. Inevitably they go and kind of, here I am stabbing a gladiator here, and then ask me to try and talk them out of the €10 cost that they got involved in. But this is a way in which the city today is one astonishingly historic city with all kinds of interesting landscapes. The final one is a picture from last week. And all the time I spent in Rome, and all the time I spent digging through the archives, there was one snowfall, I think it was in 1941, which was about 2 or 3 inches or so across the city. This was celebrated as Rome under the snow, as being a huge, great big deal. With my other hat on, as a geographer, and we're interested in climate change, amongst other things. Here's Rome last week. There's never seen snowfalls like that in its history. So I leave you with that shot of Rome in its public space and people trying to negotiate with our potential futures as we move forward. Thank you very much.